Hello, my name is Karl Inge Tangen, and I'm from the Norwegian School of Leadership and Theology. And today I will present a paper called The Story of Marcus on vision, service, and ambivalent metathinking in moral formation. Why Marcus? The character presented in this paper is not famous. Marcus, not his real name, is one of 5 leaders who serve in a leadership team led by a senior leader. In this study, I will nonetheless argue that Marcus is a moral leader in the making. I will also suggest that an analysis of how he wrestles with certain dilemmas in organizational life might contribute to the emerging field of research on moral leadership. The study will fall in 3 parts. In the first part, I will present a short version of Marcus' life story based on an ethnographic interview told in the ethnographic present. In the second part, I will analyze the story from the perspective of what I see as the major moral concerns in theories of transformational and servant leadership. And finally, in the third part, I will turn to the question of how Marcus has become a moral leader. This paper then raises the following questions. 1. In what sense can Marcus be regarded as a moral leader, seen from the perspective of theories of transformational and servant leadership? 2. What are the key factors or constructs that seems to contribute to the formation of Marcus as a moral leader? The story of Marcus. Marcus is one of the co-pastors in a relatively large Scandinavian church. He is married, has 2 children, and lives in a big city with high cost of living on a relatively low salary. During my fieldwork, I came to the conclusion that Marcus was a brilliant leader who had chosen to serve under another pastor's supervision. In order to understand this decision, we need to explore his life story. Marcus grew up in a Christian family that visited church regularly. In his youth, one event stands out as particularly formative. When Marcus was 16, he sensed that God gave him a calling. He says, "I wanted to have a career in the business world, and I had music as my second thing, and I had a good job, when one day God showed up and gave me a calling. So the dream that Joseph had at 17, I got at 16. After a year, Marcus became a youth pastor, and he began seeing leadership development as the core of his calling. He says, that whole deal of leadership development always played a very important part. That was actually the thing, I think, in my beginning years, when I was 16, 17 years old, that was the major part of my calling. However, after 3 years, Marcus had a burnout experience. Some weeks later, when he and his wife were traveling through Copenhagen on their way to a vacation, he had a strange experience. He says, I sat there and looked around in the city, and I said to my wife, this is where we're going to serve, and God will call us here. And at that time, I had no contacts with anyone in Copenhagen. I just had the feeling. Some months later, Marcus received an invitation to join the staff of his present church in Copenhagen. When Marcus started working in the church, his relationship with the senior pastor became very important. He says, I would say that I bought into the person before I bought into the vision. For me, I knew after 4 years that my leader had more influence on me than anything else. Now, why did the pastor become such a significant other? When I asked Marcus about what attracted him to his leadership, Marcus answered, I would say that for me, to relate to a leader it's important that they are tutoring and think big. He included me in his dream and in his heart. It is not his ambition for me to be 100% successful all the time, but he could live with me being in the process as a human being. Thus, Marcus also values that the leader sees him as a whole person. This is also demonstrated in times of crisis. Marcus says, "For me, it has been like he's there in the crisis and is able to listen. I'm not afraid of telling him how I really feel. You have periods where you're down, so he has a holistic view of ministry. It's not just performing in the church. You have a family, you have a whole being that needs to thrive." Yet, Marcus is also drawn to the senior leader because of his visions and his skill as a leader. Marcus describes him as a visionary entrepreneur who thinks big and wants to build a church for the city. This vision has also become Marcus' vision, in the sense that when I asked him about his dreams for the future, he started to reflect on a church for the city. He says, "A church for the city to develop the city, make the city a better place to live, I would say, has been the initiatives that we have taken. For example, to start a youth club that has made the crime rate in this area go down, to help start a rock ministry for schools." Finally, one might add that Marcus' senior leader also functions as a tutor that challenges Marcus' way of thinking. Marcus says, "I often tend to see my needs from one perspective, but the senior pastor gave me another perspective. What I would say was to develop in theology and leadership, that's the two areas I would like to develop. What he reminded me of was that one of my weak areas is counseling, listening, and personal conversation, and network, like building groups and stuff like that. And he challenged me and said, if you don't do anything about this before you're 40, you will tend to just go for your strength." Yeah, so actually I forced myself now into providing some counseling, and I've done that now. The senior pastor is not the only person with whom Marcus identifies. Being a part of a team was also a key theme as Marcus tried to describe the most important changes that have taken place in his life after he started to serve in the church. Despite these relationships, Marcus has considered leaving the church on several occasions. Sometime after his arrival in Copenhagen, he wanted to start an independent youth church. Marcus describes this as a threat to his senior pastor. However, instead of dismissing Marcus, the pastor tried to convince him to think in terms of a more multi-generational church. For more than a year, they had an open and yet tension-filled dialogue about this. A discourse that also included consultations with external experts on youth ministry. The outcome of the process was that Marcus decided to stay in the church. At another occasion, Marcus received an offer to become the senior pastor in another Scandinavian church. Initially he said yes, but then he turned the offer down. However, even though Marcus has devoted himself to the church, he sensed a tension between this commitment and other commitments to his spouse, children, and friends. He says, "There I see a major conflict in the future, a challenge, and how to lead and be in the front and set the pace, and at the same time have a life where you actually are able to think, reflect, to meditate, to be a father, a parent, a friend, and a neighbor." This conflict has several dimensions. On an individual level, Marcus sometimes asks himself whether he's getting the most out of his life. He says, "Even though at this time in your life it could seem like other people get more out of their life, and that could be financially, it could be education, it could be the fun of life." Thus, Marcus acknowledges that the path of a calling also means that he's sacrificing money, joy, education, and sometimes he doubts that this is the right path. Thus, there is a certain degree of ambivalence in the way he thinks of his own relation to the organization. The tension between organizational objectives and personal well-being also appears on a more interpersonal level. Marcus acknowledges that his entrepreneurial drive has caused not only himself, but also others to burn out. He says, my temptation would be to be caught up in the project. Without thinking about it, I've had some people coming back to me that have caused a bit of a burnout without me knowing it, and they had come back and confronted me. The following passage also demonstrates that Marcus also sees this as a systemic problem. He says, I think you can really lose the new postmodern person because they want to participate and buy into church relationships. I believe not so much for the work of it, but for the relationship of it. Thus, Marcus seems to suggest that traditional project-oriented churches can lose the postmodern person that connects to a church, not so much for the work of it, but for the relationship of it. For this reason, he suggests that there is a need for a paradigm shift that empowers the church to focus more on relationships and less on projects. He says, previous generations had other perspectives in these areas. I think it needs to be a paradigm shift in some of these areas. I'm aware that this transition is very dangerous because it could also end in a comfort idolization. This passage also reveals a degree of ambivalence concerning the new paradigm. Marcus fears that this will end up in comfort idolization. How then does Marcus deal with all of these tensions? Marcus loves to think and meditate. In order to do this, he seeks places where he can reflect. He says, I need to have a day every week where I'm kind of doing other stuff than I do in my work. I love to go to the library and find books on different subjects. I often get into time management or leadership, and I sit there and I love it. When I'm really relaxed, I start to get visions and dreams. So after Christmas and summer vacation, I start off the year with a notebook filled. Thus, one way that Marcus deals with the tensions of organizational life is to create a form of reflective space where he can reflect and learn. However, although Marcus loves to think and reflect, he can also present his inner dialogue as his toughest struggle. He says, out of 13 years of experience in leadership, it's funny to me that the biggest struggle is not as much the challenges, the jobs, the tasks, but it's how you view yourself. It's the inner dialogue with yourself. It's giving yourself, losing yourself, and saying, hey, I can do this.